things like that. But I currently live out in the desert. I worked for the Nature Conservancy. I was a Southern California director for the Nature Conservancy for about 10 or 15 years in there. Then went back and got my PhD and have been doing research on mainly lizards for about the last 15 or 20 years. And I love lizards, and so I want to sort of pass on that love to you if I can. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what's a lizard. And the first thing to understand is they're not amphibians. So the amphibian is on your right, and dinosaurs or to birds, but not to amphibians at all. And so I think that's what that says. So the study of reptiles is sometimes called herpetology, which combines reptiles and amphibians together, which makes no sense. That's like studying plants and birds at the same time. It just doesn't make any sense. So we're not gonna talk about amphibians today. We're gonna talk about lizards. We're not gonna be talking about anole lizards. These are primarily, there is a native one in the Florida or to Texas area, and that's this one, but they are mostly in the Caribbean and in Central and South America. There is a population, you might have them in your yards. We're not gonna be talking about those either. And the last one we're not going to be talking about are green iguanas. Green iguanas are found in Central and South America. There are populations that are wild in Southern California. Occasionally when I'm at my in-laws' house in Newport Beach, I'll see one on a shrub. We're not going to be talking about those. So what we're going to be talking about are native lizards. And my background is in conservation biology, which is the study of how animals are interacting with a landscape that is really dominated by humans now. And it's trying to figure out how we can coexist. That's really the theme of conservation biology. So some friends of mine and I were talking this goes back several years. We wanted to know where in North America was the most number of lizard species. Right? So I had been visiting Big Bend National Park, which is right there, and they had on their brochure that there was more species of lizards there, or reptiles, than anywhere else in North America. And I thought, well, I'm not sure that's true, but so these friends of mine and I got together, and through our own surveys and by looking at surveys that other people had done, we figured out exactly where the top place in all of North America was. So you might think Florida, and Florida's not on the map. Florida is filled with non-native lizards. There's probably only 5 or 6 that are native, so that doesn't even rank on the list at all. So the blue ones have 10 species or less, just to give you an idea. So that's more than Orange County does, but it's still not tops. The green dots there, and these dots are about 100 kilometers across, just to give you an idea of the scale that we're looking at. The green dots have about 15 or more, or less, 15 or less species on it. So you can see that they're pretty widely distributed. The yellow ones have less than 20, and Big Bend is in 20, or about 20, I guess. The orange ones are up to about 28 or so, something like that. And so you can see that there's, especially in northern Baja, California, the red ones are 30 or more. So there's 2 places down in Mexico where I have some colleagues that I do work with, and each of those has 30 species of lizards within that circle. The other circle is centered on the Coachella Valley, and it has not 30, it has 33 species. So it's the top place in all of North America for finding lizards. So if you're into lizards, that's the place you want to go if you really want to rack up a lot of species. There we go. So when I think about species, I think, how am I going to talk to you about this? And so, 33 species is a lot of lizards, obviously. And when you think about it, that's more than the mammals that are there. It's certainly more than the amphibians. It's probably more than the native birds, at least land birds. If you include some of the wetland birds, it might be not quite as much. So this is my diagram of a mountain, and for our intent, this is Mount San Jacinto. So the Orange County is on the left-hand side of San Jacinto, and the desert is on the right-hand side, or the arid side. So if you look at this, and then I layer in the lizards, that's only half of the lizards, because I didn't have space to put them in there, but you can see how many more are in the desert and how they're distributed by elevation within there. So we've got some lizards that go almost all the way up to the top of the peak. Not quite, but if you go up to the top of the tram, for instance, you will be able to, just as soon as you walk off the tram, there is a lizard species that's where it lives. It's called the southern sagebrush lizard. But otherwise, that's a little bit too high for most other lizards. You can see a lot of them are distributed, and they overlap quite a bit, which is really interesting to me, because when I was growing up and going to school, there was this axiom that they taught us in our ecology classes, that every species has a niche, and no two species can occupy the same niche, or otherwise they would compete with each other, and one would win and one would lose. And so over time, and so when you look at that, there is a lot of overlap going on here. And so what I would love to talk, this idea of no two species could occupy the same niche goes back to the 1950s. It'd be really interesting to have that discussion today, because I don't think it works at all. I think that there are so many different other things happen that control species distributions that they can have the same niche, and we have quite a few examples right here. So we're going to talk about, again, this is the place. It has more lizards than any other place in North America. But those lizards are from different areas. So let's look at the lizards that are from the coastal part of California to start out with. And we do that, here's a group of them, and we can say, so these are lizards that you might have in your backyard. Some of them you almost certainly do. So southern alligator lizards, you almost certainly have those in your backyard. Some of the skinks, like the Gilbert skink, you probably wouldn't have them in your backyard. The western skink, not so much. That's Blainville's horn lizard. You wouldn't see that one. And then the one up there that looks like a snake is actually a legless lizard. It's called Stebbins' legless lizard. It was recently named after Robert Stebbins, who, if you ever get a field guide to the reptiles of Western North America, he wrote that book. And they're in sandy areas, but they're all around here. I'm sure there's some within the grounds of the Tree of Life nursery here. I'm sure probably all of these are within the grounds there. But in terms of your yard, there's a couple others that you're going to see, but the one here that's really from this coastal zone is that southern alligator lizard. A lot of our lizards are from Baja, California. And I like to tell people that, Baja, California, we define that politically. There's a border and then now there's a wall. But in terms of biology, Baja, California goes all the way to Mount San Jacinto. So the animals and especially the reptiles, but also the plants that we see on Mount San Jacinto and in the Anza Borrego area, their affinities are more closely related to Baja California than they are to the rest of the deserts or anywhere else. And so this is just an example of some of those. The one in the top left there, it almost blends in because it's not dark enough here to get a good look at it, but it's the banded rock lizard. They're really common in the Palm Desert area, but as you would expect by their name, they're on rocks, and you just have to see them blending in with the rock there. And then we have granite spiny lizards down in the bottom left. We have orange-throated whiptail over here on the right, and a couple of night lizards, three different species of night lizards. Night lizards look like geckos. They're not. They're true lizards. The top one is a granite night lizard. The little one in the middle was recently like within the last 15 or 20 years described as a species is called the sandstone night lizard. And then the one on the right is called Wiggins. And they're all from Baja, California. But they come into our area. And so these are the animals or lizards that have moved into Southern California. Some of those, like if you go to the Santa Rosa Plateau, you'll see the granite spiny lizards, and you might see the orange-throated whiptail. The others, you really need to be up in the mountains more. A couple more from Baja, California. We've got a collared lizard there. It's called the Baja California collared lizard. They're the largest of those lizards in terms of length. They can be about like that. Big long tail. They're predators, and so those guys are out looking for other lizards to eat. And then there's a gecko called, some people call it the magic gecko because nobody ever sees it. And then the bottom one is called a black-tailed brush lizard. The magic gecko I have not seen before, I probably never will because I don't go out at 3 o'clock in the morning. But I was told that if you really want to see one, there's a road that goes down into Borrego Springs from Julian. You have to go down there. And that road is the only place people ever see it, but you have to be on the road at 3 o'clock in the morning on a very wet summer night. So it has to be like 100 degrees at 3 o'clock in the morning and have recently rained. I will never see that lizard. Again, it used to be called, some people call it magic gecko. The official name is Swatix gecko, which it's named after a fellow who discovered it. So that's that one. And we're going to look at lizards that are from the larger desert area that, for instance, the Mojave Desert and the Great Basin Desert. And so there's a Mojave fringe-toed lizard. We're going to talk a lot more about fringe-toed lizards later. There's a different collared lizard, which is the Great Basin collared lizard. And if you go up into Joshua Tree National Park, there's places you can go there and almost be guaranteed of seeing these guys. And then there is another night lizard. Again, look just like a little gecko, but they're not. And that one's called the yucca night lizard, or sometimes just called the desert night lizard. So calling them a night lizard is a little bit of a misnomer because they're up around all day long, but they're hiding underneath things, and they eat termites and things. And so you have to lift like a branch of a Joshua tree up and a dead branch that's on the ground and lift it up, and they'll be crawling underneath that. But they have vertical eyelids like a cat, right? And so the first people who looked at it said they must be nocturnal because nocturnal animals have vertical eyelids, but they don't. They just don't come out they're always underneath things, basically, so they're never out in the bright sunshine. A couple more. There is I mentioned real briefly the high elevation one, which is called the southern sagebrush lizard. They're very closely related to the actual sagebrush lizard, so that's from the Great Basin. But these are the top two there are the southern sagebrush lizards, and we're going to talk a little bit how you tell the difference because they look really similar to a fence lizard, which is one you probably have in your backyard. So western fence lizards, which are the lower one there. And then there's the hot deserts, and there's a lot that are associated with that. So there is a leopard lizard in the top left, long-tailed brush lizard up here in the right, and then the whiptail. And you might have whiptails in your yard as well, really long tails down here. And then these are all the same species, but they're incredibly variable. When I take people out to look for to lizards and I'll say, well, that's a side-blotched lizard. And they say, well, I don't see the side-blotch. Well, sometimes you do. The one in the middle, you can see the side-blotch right underneath his armpit. But most of the time, you don't see it. And they look a lot like just about any other lizard you see out there. And they're, like I said, extremely variable. The coastal ones look a lot more like that one down there. But you go up in the mountains and you get them all. And the easiest way for me to tell is that they have really smooth skin. All the other lizards have pretty apparent scales, and these are just very smooth skin. Here's a few more. Now, this is like the most common lizard that you will ever see in the desert, and probably the most common lizard you'll see around here, the side-blotched lizards. They're really quite common. But they do, for me, and this is sort of an epiphany that I came up with. When I first showed up in the desert, I thought, and I was working for the Nature Conservancy, so we're all focused on rare things and endangered things. I thought, well, these guys are dirt common. I'm going to ignore them. And then later, for some of the questions that I had as a researcher, having a dirt common lizard was the best possible thing you could have because you get lots and lots of data. So one of the things that I've been looking at, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, is what's happening as the desert and every place in Southern California is getting hotter and drier. And so I can see everybody seems to be moving up, but the data is kind of sparse because you don't see them very often. You see so many of these guys, and you can't miss them because they just are everywhere, that we've actually documented how fast they are climbing up the mountain as a result of this increasing temperatures and dryness. So the bad news is they have to do that. The good news is they are doing it, and they're not going extinct. The other interesting thing about these guys, and a researcher at UC Santa Cruz came up with this, is that they play a game called rock, paper, scissors. So you've all played rock, paper, scissors, right? So they have come up with the game, and it's all about reproduction. So the one in the middle has got an orange throat. Orange-throated side-blotched lizards have a behavioral pattern that they have very large territories, and they like lots of girls in that territory. So it's like one boy and lots of girls. So they have a harem, essentially. The one here, again, it's a little hard to see, is a blue-throated variety. Blue-throated varieties are a little bit more like me. I've been married to the same person for 50 years. And that's what they don't live for 50 years, but they are monogamous. They have a small territory, and they have one female, and that's all they have, and that's all they want. And then there's another one, which is the bottom left there, which is the yellow one. And the yellow-throated one doesn't have a territory, but he sneaks into the orange territory, and when he's on the other side of his big territory, they sneak in and find a girl that would like a little strange, and so they get in there, and so they're able to, and so each of them are able to reproduce just fine. So it's like rock, paper, scissors. There's never one solution that wins all the time. So sometimes it's rock, sometimes it's paper, sometimes it's scissors. Sometimes it's blue, sometimes it's orange, sometimes it's yellow. But it works enough for each of them so they get to maintain those color variations over time. So when you do look at a side-blotched lizard, instead of saying, oh, that's dirt common, there is a lot of really cool things going on about them. And especially look for the throats, and you can see, if it's a blue throat, it's monogamous. If it's an orange throat, it's Lothario. He just likes as many as he can get. And the yellow throats are sneaks. There's a couple more of the desert ones that are really pretty cool. The desert iguana, which is related to the green iguana that I mentioned before. They're the longest lizard probably, at least on the desert floor, and they can be pretty long. They're vegetarians. So compared to that collared lizard that I mentioned before that's a predator and eats only bugs and lizards and maybe even small snakes, this guy almost only eats plants. And I used to think that they only ate plants, but I've seen him eat a couple bugs before, so I know that they occasionally will do that. And then down here in the bottom, there's a couple of chuckwallas. And the chuckwallas are big vegetarians. They're also related to those green iguanas. They're also vegetarians. And the whole family of these iguanas are mostly vegetarian. There's a few that mix it up a little bit in their diet, but mostly vegetarians. But the chuckwallas have color variation that is very specific to the site that they are. So that one in the bottom right that has the red back, he's in Joshua Tree National Park. The one with the white back in the middle, he's from the Santa Rosa Mountains. And if you go down into Baja, California, there's a different color. Even if you go into Phoenix, if you're familiar with a place in Phoenix, it's a county park called South Mountain. Don't know if you know it. The chuckwallas are just slate gray, except for the males have a tail that is the orange, about the color of your bottom of your t-shirt right there. And so what the chuckwallas are doing is they're flashing their tails. The reason they do that is that tail tells the girls how good their territory is. If it's a big fat tail, it's a good territory. He's been eating a lot. There's lots of food there. And if it's a good territory, the female might want to stick around, because what she wants, as much as she needs to have the male in the territory, what she wants is to have a lot of food so she can produce eggs and produce a good clutch. So she can tell the quality of the territory based on the size and shape of the tail. And so that's why a lot of these guys, you can see some of them have almost white tails. Yeah. So, I'm going to show you a chuckwalla later on. It'll be fun for you to see. Upper right is a banded gecko, very common in the desert, although they do come over in the coast a little bit. And then we have the desert spiny lizard over there on the left. So those are some of those desert animals. Some more chuckwallas, just to show you this color variation. I found them in the Grand Canyon. This guy's from the Grand Canyon. He's just speckled all over. This is another one from Joshua Tree. This is a Joshua Tree one. That one is Baja, California. That one is the Santa Rosa Mountains. And this is a girl. The girls are just sort of a mocha color, and they don't have all the color that the males do. One of the species that I've spent a lot of time doing research on is the flat-tailed horned lizard, which is the guy on the left. There's 3 different species of horned lizards in Southern California. They all kind of look alike unless you really take a good look. The flat-tailed horned lizard primarily lives in sand dunes and is exclusively in the desert, and they have a black line down the back. And it's the only horned lizard with a black line down the back. So if you see that, that's what it is. The other 4 there are all desert horned lizards. And they are incredibly good at matching their surroundings. And it's not because they look at their surroundings and say, that's what I'm going to look at. It's that if they don't match their surroundings, they're eaten almost immediately. And so only the ones that match the surroundings survive. And they're really good at just hanging pretty still. And so unless you get really close to them, you can walk right past them and you'll never see them. It just looks like gravel, or it looks like part of the rock. And so it's a challenging animal to work with. In the sand dunes, it's actually easy because anything that lives in a sand dune makes tracks. And so whenever I'm taking a group out into the sand dune, I'll say, oh, well, there's a flat-tailed horned lizard. And they'll say, what are you looking at? And I said, it's the track. And I'll just follow it. And sometimes it takes me a half an hour. But by the time I get to the end of the track, there's the horned lizard. Some more of the desert horned lizards and flat-tails down here. And then I've added a new species here, which is Blainville's horned lizard, which is the 3 off to the left there. Blainville's used to be called coast horned lizards. Some geneticists got a hold of them and said, wait a minute, they're different than the ones in Baja, California, which are different from the ones in the Cape area of Baja, California. So now there are at least 3 and maybe 4 different horned lizards between California, northern Baja, California, central Baja, California, and the Cape area. And the only one that is still called a coast horned lizard is the one at the bottom, the Cape. So this is called Blainville's horned lizard. So another species that I do a lot of work with are fringe-toed lizards because they are an endangered species. Now, the ones in the 2 left are called zebra-tail lizards. Those aren't fringe-toed lizards, but these mountains below here are. And they only live in sand dunes. That's the only place they live. And it's a real concern because there's a lot of things that go wrong with sand dunes. One is that in the Coachella Valley, they build golf courses on sand dunes. There are 130 golf courses in the Coachella Valley. It is crazy stupid. But there used to be 100 square miles of sand dunes in the Coachella Valley. Right now, there are less than 5 square miles left, and they're in small little patches. And so one of my jobs working for the Nature Conservancy was to figure out how to protect those last few patches. And so I spent a lot of time looking at these guys. And so we'll talk a little bit more about them. There are 8 species of fringe-toed lizards in North America. There's 3 that occur in California, 3 in that circle that I described for the Coachella Valley. There are 3 within that circle. There's 1 in the Mojave, which is in where the circle connects with Joshua Tree National Park. There's another one that occurs down in Anza Borrego and over into the Algodones Dunes, which is called the Colorado Desert Fringe-toed lizard. And there's those 3, and then there's 2 more in Arizona and Mexico. And then there's 2 more, actually there's 3 more in Arizona and Mexico. And then there's 2 more in way south into Baja, California, or not Baja, in central Mexico. So they're really interesting thing, but because of off-road vehicles and golf courses and all those things, they are very much at risk. And it's unfortunate because you can imagine off-road vehicle, the dune buggy guys, they look at a sand dune and said, nothing lives here. It's just a pile of sand. Why would you even think of limiting me from being able to jump up and down the dunes on my vehicle? But these guys live there, and that's the only place. They don't have an option. So when we were trying to do this conservation program, you get people saying, well, can't you just move them to another dune? And it's like, no, there's another fringe-toed lizard that lives there, right? And it's like saying, we're going to put a freeway through your house, so we're going to move you to another house, but there's already somebody living in that house. So how do you reconcile those sorts of things? So the good news is we were successful in protecting those remaining areas. It's been challenging, and it continues to be challenging, but we have been successful. So this shows you the number of fringe-toed lizard species. All those colors are different species of fringe-toed lizard. And they all look pretty similar, but they're different. One on the top left is a Mojave. The one in the middle there is a Colorado. All of the ones on the right are the Coachella Valley one. The Coachella Valley one is listed as a threatened and endangered species. And there's different ways you can tell them apart. The Coachella Valley one, so this one is the one you would see in Anza Borrego or in the Algodones Dunes, and the genus is Uma, so all of them are Umas, and the species of this one is Notata, and the Notata has to do with that black dot. So this one is the Mojave one, and it's got the black dot, but it doesn't have the red as much anyway. And this is the Coachella Valley one. It doesn't have a black dot. And so instead of being notata, it's inornata, meaning you don't have a dot. So just a few more pictures. This one up in the top is a male Coachella Valley fringe-toed lizard. The one on the bottom is a female fringe-toed lizard. And people are always saying, well, how do you know the difference between the boys and the girls? And I always tease them. I say, you're old enough to know differences between boys and girls. I don't. But there are a couple of ways to tell them apart. So one way is that male lizards, at least in breeding condition, have their sexual organs in their tail. So if you look at that top one on the left, you can see how it's sort of swollen right at the top there. That's because of his sexual organs. He has 2 sexual organs, so he can mount the female on the right or the left and use the appropriate one for whichever that is. The female doesn't have those, so her tails are just flat. There's no swelling at all, so that's the easy way to tell. But the other thing that's really interesting about these guys is, and it's not unique to fringe-toed lizards, although it's very clearly established here, is that when the female is carrying eggs, meaning she's gravid, they get bright orange. You can see how orange she is on the side right there. And so it's kind of a conundrum because you're carrying eggs, and so why would you make yourself more visible as opposed to more cryptic and in hiding? Why would that be the case? And I experienced this. Fringe-toed lizards, all lizards have individual personalities. Sometimes you'll see a fringe-toed lizard and it's running away from you before you even see it. Other times they'll just look at you and go, I have no idea what you are, but I don't care. And so I found this one gravid female who was, I don't care. So I sat down beside her and she was just foraging right beside me, and we were talking to each other, and occasionally she would turn her side to me, and she'd open up the fold of skin on her side and show me how orange she was, and then she'd close it up, and then she'd continue going on. I think, why is she displaying to me? And then, so we spend a lot of time, and then off in the distance I see a male fringe-toed lizard, and he sees her, and he's just running so fast because he's so happy to find a girl. And he runs right up to her, and she does the same thing. She just flashes that orange at, and he just deflated, and he goes, oh, and he walked away. So I always tell people, wouldn't that be kind of cool if if you go to a bar and you want to know if somebody's receptive or not, they just flash a color, and it's either reception or not reception. And unlike people, the lizards pay attention to it. So if it's orange, they walk away. And so they bury into the sand. So this is just his face. They can actually breathe the sand, air that's in the sand, and spend hours and hours, even weeks, underneath the sand if they need to. But sometimes you just see their faces poking out. And those are the fringes on their toes, which is why they're called fringe-toed lizards. And that's what gives them the extra traction, so that when on loose sand, they can it's like having snowshoes. They can really move fast on the sand dunes, and so nothing can really catch them on a sand dune. And just a few more sand dune pictures, because I got a lot of pictures. And these are the tracks in the sand dunes. And so it's kind of hard to see this, but if it drags its tail and it's straight, it's a whiptail. If it drags its tail but it wiggles, it's a desert iguana. If it is kind of irregular, but you have a big dot and a little dot together, big dot and a little dot, that's a fringe-toed lizard. And if all the dots are the same size, it's a flat-tailed horned lizard. So you can do a survey for lizards on dunes, and you never see the lizards, but you're always 100% right, because all of these tracks are foolproof. Once you figure it out, you never are wrong. And you can track each animal right back to wherever it is just by following those. So just a couple of the hard to identify species. We've got the granite spiny lizards. We have desert spiny lizards. We have western fence lizards. And it's hard to tell them apart. And that's one of I take my students, which my students in the class I teach look just like all of you. There's no age separation. I have 70 and 80-year-olds, and I have 20-year-olds in my class. And we go out and I teach them how to do this. But there are things that you can follow. If it's got a collar, like the one in the top left, it's a desert spiny lizard. All the males, all the females, and all the babies have those collars. If it doesn't have a collar but it's really big, it's probably a granite spiny lizard, which is the next one. And if it's not that big, but it has a dark line going right out of its eye, right there, it's a western fence lizard. And if it doesn't have that line and its scales look really smooth, it's the southern sagebrush lizard. They're all the same genus, Scoloporus, and they overlap a lot, especially now as climate change is making them move up the mountain. And so what we're finding is that the fence lizards are moving into the sagebrush lizard habitat, but they don't seem to have a problem with that. So that gets with that sort of niche separation that doesn't seem to be a big deal. So I pay a lot of attention as to whether they're on the ground or on rocks or on boulders or on big boulders. And the granite spinies are on the biggest boulders, so it's bigger than me. But the sagebrush and the fence lizards are on the middle-sized boulders. And there are side-blotched lizards, and they're always not always, but mostly on the ground. So there is a little bit of a separation there, but not between fence lizards and sagebrush lizards. They do exactly the same thing, and they do overlap in space. And so what you're looking for is, if you can see the back sort of looks like it's shiny, then it's a sagebrush lizard, and if it's rough, it's a fence lizard. And if you can see the black line going out of the eye, it's definitely a fence lizard. These are they have collars. So collars mean it's a desert spiny lizard, right? So you see the collar? This is a female right there, male up there, and a baby down there. They all have collars. These are the southern sagebrush lizards. And they do the same thing that the fringe-toed lizards do. These are two females that are gravid, and they've got the orange on them right there. These two are males. He's got a little bit of orange, but that deep blue is pretty amazing. And there's a male and a female together on the same rock. This is the granite spiny lizard, and you can see the males, when they're in breeding condition, are just as gaudy and beautiful as you can imagine. And then when the female is gravid, she gets an orange face. So that's a gravid female right there. And these are fence lizards, and again, it's kind of hard to see in sometimes, but the black line going out of the eye makes it a fence lizard. Talk a little bit about this, and so I was mentioning how we can see how they're moving up the mountains. So these are side-blotched lizards. You can see the side-blotched, smooth back. And each of those colors is a different year on the same trail. So this is one trail, and this is another trail. And they're really easy to see, and you can see, so we were seeing them very commonly at these elevations, but at these higher elevations, they have only showed up since 2018. They weren't there before. They weren't there. Same thing here. They're just showing up here after, in this case, 2022. That's the first time we found them at this site at that elevation. So we're actually able to document these animals moving up the slope. Again, good news, bad news. Good news is they are moving and they're surviving and they're doing fine. Bad news is they have to move. The fence lizards are moving a little bit, but not as readily. This one, we never get high enough, and so that we couldn't see any difference there. But on this one, we got high enough, and we actually were able to see the fence lizards moving up there as well. So just because we're at a nursery, I wanted to point out something. And if you like lizards, and I don't know why you'd be here if you didn't like lizards, and you want lizards in your yard, the thing to do is to plant natives. You really have to plant natives. And so this is my house. Every plant there is a native plant, front yard and backyard. I've got all kinds of lizards in both. But what I realized is because my neighbors have cats that they let out, and there's a native bird there that everybody loves except for me, which is called a roadrunner. And they will eat every lizard in your yard. And so what I do is I create hiding spaces, which in this case are piles of rocks. And as long as I can do that, the roadrunner gets a couple of them once in a while, but there's always a population of lizards that are able to sustain themselves in the yard. The one thing I learned very early on is not to put bird feeders out. And you say, why wouldn't you put a bird feeder in? You like birds. I do like birds. My wife and I were having lunch in the backyard, and we had a hummingbird feeder, and hummingbirds were going in and out. This roadrunner walked up and was looking up at the bird feeder, and we're going, oh, isn't this cool? And he jumped straight up and grabbed a hummingbird off the feeder and ate it. And so from that point on, said no more bird feeders, and I just plant native plants that the hummingbirds like, and it works just fine. I have more hummingbirds in my yard than anybody else around me has, and the roadrunners just are going hungry, and that's okay with me. So in this case, it's hard to tell, but if you look at that rock right there, there's a side-blotched lizard sitting on top of that one. And then in the backyard, there's a desert spiny. You can see the collar there and see the desert spiny. So that is the end of my slideshow, but it's not the end of the talk. I'm brought a show and tell for you. Here, you hold him. So he was a part of an experiment from a professor at Cal State Fullerton. And the question they were asking is that they were out in the desert and they saw chuckwallas that had different shapes. And some of them were short and stubby and fat, and others were more long. And they were trying to say, well, why is that? And they said, well, it seems to be related to food. The long ones had more food available. The short and stubby ones, not so much food, except for on a really good wet year, and then there'd be tons of food. And so he thought, well, then the question is the size and shape of the lizard genetic, or is it related to just being this feast or famine diet? And so he collected a bunch of them and he raised them and went through a couple of generations. So this one is from a lava field called the Pisgah lava field, which is all black rocks, and which is why he's black. Chuckwalla's main predator, they have a couple of predators, but the main predator are red-tailed hawks. And if you stand out on the rock, you're going to be food. And so he blends in perfectly with a black rock, and so that his whole population is black. And he's the he looks chubby to you, but compared to the other one, this is like the greyhound, and the other one is much shorter and much, much wider, and big jowly thing, and so it's genetic. It's not just related to what they eat. So the experiment was over. I said, okay, what are you going to do with all your chuckwallas? Because he had a lot of chuckwallas, and he had to have a permit from the state to have the chuckwallas. So he said to the state, I've got X number of chuckwallas. What do you want me to do with them? And they said, you have 3 options. One of those options is not letting them go. You can never, ever, ever let them go. So the other option is you can destroy them all. The other option is to find somebody who wants to use them for education. And the third option is somebody who else wants to do another experiment. So I said, I'll do education. So you guys are the justification for him not being destroyed. So he's a vegetarian again. And because all of my yard is native plants, I spend a lot of time collecting flowers out of my yard and feed him those. And that's his favorite. He loves desert willow flowers. He loves desert mallow, the orange apricot mallow. Those are like his favorite. He is pretty fond of sweet bush, which the other name for sweet bush is Chuckwalla's Delight. I'll tell you a little story about that. I was down in Baja, California on an island off the coast of Bahia de Los Angeles. And I noticed, I felt like something was looking at me, and I stopped and I was walking up this wash, and the hillsides were covered with chuckwallas, and they were all staring at me. And I thought, well, this is interesting. And that island chuckwallas down there are much bigger, so they're like this big. And I thought, well, this is weird. And then I noticed that the sweet bush, or the Chuckwalla's Delight, was growing in the middle of the wash. But I could see where they had pruned all of it around the side, but they couldn't get to the middle. So I went to the middle and I picked off a flower, and they all went, oh my God. And so I sat down and I put the flowers on my knees, and they all came and crawled up on me and ate the flowers off my knees. So anyway, otherwise, if I can't get any of those flowers, then he seems to, of the things I can buy at the store, the thing he prefers the most is collard greens. Lettuce doesn't do a thing for him. Kind of goes for dandelion greens, but if it's a choice between collard greens and dandelions, he'll always go to collard greens. Any other questions?